Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the third day of Dhaka Lit Fest here at Bangla Academy. Shortly, we shall begin our session titled A World Without a Center with Amitav Ghosh, Abdul Razak Girna, and Pankaj Mishra with Nilanjana S. Roy. Can we please have a round of applause for them? Thank you. And with that, I would kindly request our honorable speakers to please come on stage.
Good morning, and what a pleasure to be in Dhaka, especially in this company. I know that many of you have read all of their books, and I see enthusiastic heads nodding in the top row. But I'm going to go from the heart here instead of as a critic. I just want to respond to this moment as a reader and to say that I'm extremely grateful for your lifetime of work, all three of you in different ways. Amitav Ghosh, he's always introduced as he needs no introduction, but I'm blown away often by the depth of what he's done, both in his historical work, his novels, his many novels from The Glass Palace to the Ibis trilogy, to the first two novels which are close to my heart, The Circle of Reason, The Shadow Lines, and to the fables and the non-fiction that is so important to our times, both in terms of understanding what's happening ecologically and the background of colonialism, its many legacies. Abdul Razak Gurna, his books have for years been read and circulated because they taught us something new, at least they taught my generation something new about what the center of the world was and wasn't and where it might be. He shifted my horizons from, memories of departure all the way to afterlives, and with the many, many novels in between and the short stories as well, By the Sea, Gravel Heart. He helped me to see that the center need not be in some far-off, distant Western country. It could also be in the Indian Ocean. It could also be in many parts of Africa. And that there was a kind of conversation, sometimes brutal, but sometimes also gentle and delicate, that was going on in a host of small lives. Pankaj Mishra, for my generation, and I was glad to hear yesterday when I was talking to some of the students here, his work has been a force to reckon with in helping us understand the changes of this century, and a lot of them have been filled with promise, but they have also been harsh and violent. And many years ago, he won our hearts with first Butter Chicken in Ludhiana, which was one of the most unusual Indian travel books. He just went out as a young man to take a look at his country, and he reported honestly, without nostalgia or sentimentality. The Romantics followed the adventures of a young man, Samar, in search of a writing life. And then after that, there were the many non-fiction books that covered everything from the Buddha, Suffering, The Age of Anger, which he has written about so well. And he's finally back to fiction with Run and Hide. And I was wondering whether I could start at the very beginning. Abdul Razak Da, and my apologies, I am going to call Abdul Razak Da and Amitav Da, because of the enormous respect in which I hold them as people as well as their work. I hope that's all right. But there you were, you left Zanzibar at the age of 18, and you found yourself in London as a young man making your way in a world that was both familiar and that was very strange. And you started with writing notes in your diary, I hear, just reflections on the place that you found yourself in. And that gradually grew not into a play and not into a set of essays, but into your first novel, Memories of Departure. I read it with such pleasure, and then years later I learned that you'd had such a struggle to be published. It wasn't an automatic progress into being a writer. And the question I wanted to ask you was, what was it about the love of fiction and the novel that kept you going? What was there between despair, determination, and hope that made you into the writer that you've become?
Well, excuse me. Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you all for being here. Yes, well, I don't know if there's a simple answer to this, but I think my experience of becoming a writer was there was a commitment to something, to doing something. It's a little bit like migrating. I think of these as life decisions, you know. So the commitment to write when it became so, rather than simply writing things down, but to write, to be heard, then it's not an easy thing to give up and say, oh, well, that didn't work, let me try something else, you know. So even though it took a while to actually be published, although I don't think that's a unique experience for a writer. I think a lot of writers do have that. And also, it doesn't mean that you're sitting down doing nothing else. You know, it's just saying, all right, I wish somebody would publish my book. You write another one, which is what I did. Or you continue with your education, in my case, write your PhD, or whatever it is. But in the meantime, that commitment to whatever it was, the ambition, the desire, the need to say whatever it is that makes writers go to all those lengths to put things together, that doesn't go away. It almost did. And I expect that too is not a unique experience. The writers do have, as they're waiting to get their work disseminated, published, and read and understood. There are, I'm quite sure, many moments of thinking, is it worth it? Not is it worth it for me, but perhaps there isn't any need for this, what I'm doing. Perhaps it's not worth much. And those sorts of doubts, I expect, certainly for me, are kind of like endemic, as it were, to the occupation, to the vocation of being a writer.
Thank you so much for that. And just one more question. Did you know from the start, though, that you wanted to build a life in writing? You were already a reader. Did you know from the start that you wanted to build a life in writing? You were already a reader.
No, I didn't know from the start anything. I just kind of meandered into this, and then, like I was saying, you know, it's like once you've made that commitment, you think, yeah, I've got to make this work. I'm going to try, because I do have a sense of the things that are necessary to say, or I did. I still do, but it was that, I think, that was that kept the business going. It wasn't that I want to be a writer in some kind of imagined sense of a writer is like this and I want to be like that. I think it was a sense of there are ways of seeing and describing and talking about certain ideas and certain places which either are not there or are misrepresented, and I want to say something about that. So it was that was the thing that took me in this direction.
And Amitavda, I have memories of the legend behind the writing of The Circle of Reason and The Shadow Lines. You were staying in what you described as a Delhi Barsati that was a kind of flaming, you know, really hot rabbit hutch-like place. And you already had a career mapped out. You could have easily become an academic and just stayed with being a professional historian. You were teaching at Delhi University then. And you were writing both The Circle of Reason and Shadow Lines with a kind of, again, a determination and urgency, a conviction that the stories that you were beginning to tell, in the case of A Circle of Reason about Alu, you know, as a fugitive, finding his way from India to North Africa. It's strange how many of your journeys start to intersect also and come together. And again, what was it that made you keep going? And at that time, there wasn't much of a publishing scene in India. You know, you weren't writing for the fame or the celebrity or anything of the sort. It was just the story that was pushing you on. And did you say to yourself at any point, I want to be a novelist? Or was it just the story?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure for me to be here, especially in this company. I feel all of us, Pankaj, Abdulrazak, and I have been in sort of conversation with each other for a very long time. So it's really a great pleasure to be here with them. For me, I must say, I knew quite early that that writing was what I wanted to do, because I was a very bookish child. I read a lot. I remember, even as a child, just being completely sort of drawn into stories, being lost in stories, and the love of writing begins with the love of reading. So I always wanted to do that. And I was very struck yesterday by something that Nuruddin said, which is that, there's almost something occult about the experience of writing. It's like it happens in some other body or in some other state of mind, an altered state of mind, So I think that just seizes hold of you and pushes you on. And I knew I would have been desperately unhappy doing, being an academic or whatever. So this was really the only path available to me, and I just wanted to sort of push through it, and and I must say, I think I feel incredibly lucky at the end of all these years, 40 years of writing, that I can do it, and people will read my books, and I can make a living from it. It just seems a miracle to me, honestly.
I see what you mean. And Pankaj again, there was a path that was mapped out for you. You came from Jhansi, and you were supposed to probably take competitive exams, as we were discussing, and find a profession, something serious and respectable. And instead, at the age of 19, you spent time in Benares, and you were reading a lot at that stage. You were reading half of Europe and a lot of Indian writing as well. And 10 years later, that turns into your second book, The Romantics, which is about the struggles of a young man to form himself in a certain way, through the imagination, through reading everything that he loves so much. But he's also up against the real world, and that world is gritty and sometimes violent, and sometimes there's the dislocation of what started to become your great subject. You have to cut away your past in order to move into the future. But then what does that do to you? Perhaps I'm going too fast, but could you just go back to that young self, that was forged again. This is something that everyone has in common, out of reading, out of the process of learning to love books or stories that you're told. And did you know that you were going to spend your life in writing, and what is it that pulled you so fiercely towards it?
Thank you, Nilanjana, also for your kind introductions. And let me also say what an honor it is to be in such distinguished company as Abdur Razak and Amitabh, both authors I've read who've been, kind of intellectual inspiration for me for several decades now. I'm frankly embarrassed to speak of my own journey or my trajectory. Perhaps easier to speak in a more general way of my companions, and with whom I share, I think, a certain kind of oppositional space. When we talk about the motivation to write, in different ways, whatever we've written right from the beginning, Circle of Reason or whichever book you think of, it's been an attempt to open up a different space in the world of Anglo-American letters, with which we are intimately connected. And I think a large part of the motivation comes from realizing that the experience you're trying to articulate has not been articulated before, not to the same extent, let's say, as the Anglo-American experience, as the experience of a writer living in England or America. And that hunger to put on page a certain world of feeling and emotion, you may not be very conscious of it early on, but having not seen it in the books you've read, you're driven by that feeling that perhaps I will be able to write about this and bring it to the attention of readers who have had no access to this part of the human experience. So when I look back, I feel that it's that sense of being in a space that had not been mapped, that had not been explored, and which also, writing about it, was going to face resistance. That was the other experience, which then at some point becomes a kind of motivation too, that you're going to push back against the resistance, because obviously, novels being not accepted for publication because certain experience is not deemed important enough. That you have to fight against constantly. So I think what I'm trying to say is that my experience, or if I dare say our experience, is to a large extent defined by this feeling of being in a different and oppositional space. Very different from that of a, let's say, a white American or a British writer.
That's what I felt years ago, and it's an experience that many of your readers who overlap actually have in common. The feeling that you created a map where there was none, all three of you, in very different ways. We didn't have to grow up with that absence because your books were there. And I'm hoping a little later that this will also turn into a conversation between the three of you if you feel like that. But the reason I wanted to refer to my notes is because I wrote down a few things that from your words and interviews that I thought might help us point the conversation forward. And Abdul Razak, over the course of 3 decades, your novels changed, I think, the way your readers understood what was cosmopolitan and what was not. When we're looking at something like the center of the world, so many of us, I'm so glad that this particular session is happening in Dhaka. Because if you grow up in Dhaka or Delhi or Jhansi or Calcutta or Zanzibar or Nairobi, what you were told is that the center of the world was always elsewhere. It was never where you were. Your stories were not that important. And you wrote at Gravelheart, the whole world ends up in London somehow. The British never left anyone in peace and squeezed everything good out of everybody and took it home. And now, here we are, a bedraggled lot who've come to share in it. And right from the start and developing over the course of those very different novels, your subject has been the importance of small lives. So not the importance, perhaps, but the essential, what small lives have to tell you is that they also carry a part of the world in them. And through their migrations, through their displacement, through their dislocations, they too have something to say about the world. And your respect for what were apparently small and inconsequential lives, right from the start, with Daud, with so many of your other protagonists, it just comes through the novels. What taught you to look in that direction?
Is this my microphone? Where's yours? Disappeared. Well, you put it very nicely there. I think actually it's simple. I'm not interested in the lives of those figures that are, kind of occupy the center stage and written about in the newspapers and so on, because they're already there, already performing their business and their stuff. And to some extent, there is a paradigm to how they behave or what they mean or their significance to the world or whatever it is. So I guess I'm more interested in the complications of ordinary life, because that's where most of us live, and that's where all the kind of the dilemmas and difficulties of being human are kind of played out. They were not on that big stage, or not in the newspapers or whatever. So it's not a kind of like an unprecedented commitment to say, I'm interested in small lives. That's one dimension, anyway, in answer to that question or that issue. The other is, I think that the places and the people I write about are, to me, interesting because they're familiar. They're what I know about. I don't rub shoulders with heroes, but I do rub shoulders with people going about their lives and coping. So it's again, not a great stretch. In fact, it would be an even bigger stretch for me to write about heroes than to write about ordinary people and how they do things. And ultimately, it's also a desire to say, I guess, let's not neglect those small lives, because what's so tremendous and what I really admire, if I can use that word, I'm not sure if it's exactly the right word, about the way that human beings cope, the resourcefulness with which they cope with what they encounter in life, I think is one of the few things I can admire about human beings. There's a great deal, of course, else in addition to that, which is not at all admirable. But what is admirable is the way people do engage and cope with the traumas and the things they encounter. And I mean just people in an ordinary sense. I don't mean people who do heroic things. And sort of course, there's that as well. People who have, tremendous difficulties and cope with that. I don't mean that. I mean just the ordinary wear and tear of life. That's why I'm interested in small lives.
Thank you. I do have one housekeeping problem out here. The clock doesn't seem to be on. Could it? Yeah, all right, so we're off the clock. But could one of the volunteers just let me know when we have 15 minutes to the end of the session, because we will want to pull the audience in. Apologies for this. Amitav Da. Again, I just often felt that, I'm just going to discard the notes and go from the heart again. I felt that with your fiction, what you did was unconsciously, or very consciously, very deliberately, I've never been sure which, you wrote against the histories that we were consuming as children. You know, all of our histories of the British in India, or the British in the world, or colonialism in general, and how it worked, were pretty much a series of viceroys and, the deeds of Westerners conquering savage continents. I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's really the way G.A. Henty and etc. were passed down to us. And in so many of your characters, whether it's the Glass Palace, people on the Myanmar Long March, or whether it's Diti in the Ibis trilogy, and others who were either part of forced labor or who were pressed into an army that was not theirs, fighting for a country that was not theirs, you put back these voices. At that point, were you doing this more as a historian, or was it what you were seeing as you went about the process of both research and imagining? Did you feel a need to correct the record, or was that automatically something that fiction gave you the power to do?
Well, actually, many of my books really begin with family histories. So, like with The Glass Palace, I had an uncle who lived and worked in Burma. So I started trying to trace his life and to try and understand, what his life and his circumstances would have been. And it was from there, and my father had been a soldier in the British Indian Army in the Second World War. He'd been in Burma. But, he hated the INA because, he was just brought up to hate them. So I got led into this story, and then in Malaysia, I went around interviewing these elderly men who'd been soldiers in the INA. And I must say it was one of the most moving experiences of my life, because these were elderly men, but they had been young in 1941, 42. They were almost all of them plantation workers. And they talked about how, when the Japanese came in, that was the first time they could actually leave the plantation. They also talked about the incredible joy of not having to eat according to your caste. Because in the British Indian Army, this commensality was completely banned. You had to eat, each battalion belonged to a certain caste, and you had to eat the food that was prescribed for that caste. And of course, the soldiers hated it. They wanted to eat what everyone was eating. But it's a very strange thing how this whole food thing played such an important part in their sort of revolutionary fervor. But I found those stories just incredibly moving. The stories of these, I went to Gwalior and interviewed Gurdial Singh Dhillon, who was one of the INA 3 who were prosecuted. And he was a, fourth or fifth generation Sepoy who became, an officer. And again, he kept talking about the whole food thing, how he had to sneak off, to the men's ranks to eat dal and chapati. because in the officers' mess they were served, roast beef and pork, you know. So, he talked about how at the battlefield in Jitra, when the British were decisively defeated by the Japanese, one of the reasons why they stayed loyal to the British is simply because the British won. They kept winning. But once they lost, suddenly they were confronted with this question, who am I? Who do I belong to? And those of them who turned, yes, but those of them who turned with a kind of desperate, it was as if they had suddenly found themselves. And they fought with a kind of crazed valor, on the battlefield. So I think more than any other colonial subjects, it's really the soldier, it's the sepoy who really represents that divided consciousness, which is a very interesting state of mind, if you like.
Again, MC, I think we all see it, the threads of commonality, the way in which all of you talk about, many of your characters have these split selves, these selves that are divided, which is not always, as you've said, such a bad thing, But it's as though you're carting part of yourself around and you've ripped away a certain set. And that's where, again, both your first book of fiction and the next book, a full 20 years later, I get the sense that non-fiction was a satisfying place for you. It was the appropriate place to be in, with the essays and the explorations of what was happening with the decline of the West. But when you came back to fiction, of course, people will always ask, why did there have to be such a long gap? But sometimes you're happy where you are. And it's only when you reach a point of dissatisfaction with the story that cannot be told in any other way that you reach for the power of fiction. I'm guessing that was it with Run and Hide. Run and Hide takes up something that I didn't think could be turned into a novel, which is the experience of being deeply disillusioned, by a certain kind of, by your country, but also by a certain kind of literary ambition, whether that's represented by a real writer, Naipaul, or by a fictional writer. And there's a great deal of pain and brutality, which is shot through by this search again for something a little more meaningful in the middle of this chaos and this worldly success. And you knew that this had to be fiction, but why?
Ranjana. I suppose, fiction is still, despite all the proclamations that the novel is dead or fiction has become less persuasive, literary fiction is in trouble, it remains the best arena to stage those instances of divided consciousness, like the stories Amitabh just told of these soldiers. In conventional histories or conventional non-fiction narratives, you'll just be told that they moved from serving the British Army to fighting for the INA. But the real reasons which, were really, I suppose, not something that non-fiction could handle, non-fiction could talk about at great length, certainly not be able to dramatize them. And I think, from the very beginning of the modern novel, it's been the best place for explaining, describing just how we are all essentially split selves. The so-called unitary self does not exist, and that this is the place where the modern human being comes to recognize himself or herself. This is the novel is the place. And so ultimately the struggle for truth in nonfiction can only be partially realized, can only be partially successful. You have to move to fiction to understand the profoundly ambiguous ways in which human beings operate. So I think, once you've tasted it, and I grew up reading fiction, wanting to be a writer of fiction. So even, I had this long detour into nonfiction. I knew I wanted to go back to it. because the really interesting stuff was being left out of everything I was writing.
You know, that makes a lot of sense. One of the prompts for this session was a prompt about what the novel should be about. And I'm a little wary of the idea that the novel should be about anything, but we are also writing at, the start of this extremely turbulent century, where a lot has changed, but a lot of the old orders seem to be breaking down. And do you feel the need to address that in fiction yourself, or do you feel that you've done enough of that, you've looked at the maps, you've traced certain journeys? And where do you want to take the novel from here? Sorry, I should have made that.
Well, I suppose that could be addressed to all of us, as well as you. I'm not sure if this is a more turbulent century than other centuries, really. Maybe there is always a sense that the times we're living in are a crisis time. But, I mean, if you were to say the 1920s or the late 19th century, I mean, depending on where you were, it could easily also feel like a period of crisis. I'm sure it would have done if you were living in what ended up being the colonized world, or in parts of Africa, the transformations that were taking place, the 1950s with the decolonization, you name it. So I'm not sure if we're living in exceptionally turbulent times. But in any case, speaking for myself only, I have always been conscious that what I want to write about, or what I do write about, is what I what I see, what is in front of me, what I know. Now this doesn't have to be something that's actually taking place right now. It can also be reflection on the consequences of something that's taken place before. You're talking about the divided loyalties of the Sepoys. How do you say it? Sepoy, okay. You're talking about the divided loyalties of the Sepoy. In my last novel, Afterlives, I was all from the beginning interested in the conflict, the war as it happened. This is 1914-1918 war, as it happened in our part of the world, in what was then West Africa, or what is now Tanzania. Because the combatants in that war, on both sides, were Africans, largely, although there were also Indians. The Indian battalions were brought in. And the irony of that struck me from the very beginning. It hadn't really fully struck me as growing up with that. But when I gave more thought to it, the irony of it struck me from the beginning. These are Africans, mercenaries in the service of colonial forces, and the ultimate outcome of this will be to decide who is going to be the colonizing power, who's going to be the colonizers. And thinking and worrying about what was the motivation for doing this. Why did people, and I'm also thinking about India, about the Gurkhas, or whatever. Of course, there is an element of just economy involved, people wanting to be paid for doing so. But killing each other, that's a little bit steeper than doing something demeaning just because you need to live. So those must have felt like turbulent times. And since as a novelist, or speaking for myself again, as a novelist, I try to speak about things like that are in front of me, injustices, or these incomprehensible historical moments, these bewildering events that we are still not quite working out, or have been misrepresented. It seems to me that that's what a novelist can do to address the times, turbulent or otherwise.
Yes, that's a good reminder. And Amitav, that the possibilities of the novel ahead. Yesterday I was actually delighted, though I liked the nutmegs curse, to hear you say that you were a little tired of living in non-fiction, because that means automatically that you are going to return either to the novel or to fables. And one of the writers I learnt of from you was Leslie Marmon Silko. Okay? And I just wanted to ask you whether you think this is, insofar as novelists or writers have a task, but a direction, let's say, to go into. She says old stories and new stories are essential. They tell us who we are and they enable us to survive. And then she said something that really moved me, because it suddenly placed your books as well, all of your books, in a certain kind of history, a living history of writers who've come before. She said, we thank all the ancestors, and we thank all those people who keep on telling stories generation after generation. Because if you don't have those stories, you don't have anything. And I immediately thought, yes, this is what you've been doing with fiction for a very long time. You've been telling us the stories that we need to hear, and sometimes drawing on the older forms. So often when you deliver a lecture on fiction or something of the sort, you start off with linked stories that are drawn from Bengali folklore or the British days or something of the sort. And it seems to be so important to carry the old together with the new. And is that, do you think, where you're going to go with the next few books, or is it too early to tell?
I do think that, we live in, I would differ with Abdul Razak here about, how disrupted the times are. Because, even in the 19th century or early 20th century or whatever, if you were a villager living in India, really the First World War, Second World War didn't touch you at all. And this was also true, I think, for most people in China lived through a period of incredible disruption where the entire society was disrupted. The thing about the crisis of today is that it's not just the disruptions between the political disruptions. It's that if you're a villager living in Borishal, your land is going under. The whole environment is turning against you in ways that make your ways of life impossible. And I think that is what makes this particular moment and the years ahead so mystifying, really. We just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, you just look at the disruptions every day that are happening everywhere in the world. In Italy, they have 4 extreme weather events every single day. Can you imagine? So these sorts of disruptions, I think, are literally unprecedented in the history of humanity. How are we going to write about them? I don't think those old forms of the novel really offer us many ways of dealing with this. So, we have to try and find our own ways, all of us. And for me, I've found pre-modern Bengali folklore a source of real enrichment and reinvigoration, if you like. So that's certainly been, a very rich field for me. Yes.
Can I add something to that? I think, this is actually probably a good opportunity to confess to my divided consciousness as a novelist, which is, I feel like novel has been a perfect place, as I said, to describe split human selves, to describe the ambiguity of human affairs. But at the same time, I still think it gives human beings a kind of centrality that perhaps ought to be withdrawn. And perhaps the novel has fetishized the human being or put the human individual at the center of history in a way it shouldn't have, or at least we should start to interrogate that assumption. So when we talk about pre-modern stories or pre-modern tales, I think we're immediately struck by the presence of the non-human in those stories. And I feel like whatever direction we take next, and a greater emphasis on the non-human, or what has been threatened by the human, is important. Because otherwise, we run the risk of a certain kind of intellectual moral narcissism if we keep talking about just the human self and its dividedness over and over again in different contexts, in different historical contexts. I think we certainly need to acknowledge that, I agree with Amitav that this crisis is unprecedented in one respect. To be faced with planetary extinction, that's not something previous generations have confronted. So this is something quite unique. And it does, it demands from us a degree of intellectual initiative and agility that wasn't demanded previously. And I think the same is true for people working with the novel or people working with storytelling.
Okay, but as far as I see, there is no opposition between these positions. To say that there is a particular crisis, which is obviously climate change, doesn't mean that we now have to turn the full beam of our attention onto that and not continue to focus on ordinary or small lives. It doesn't seem to me that one needs to exclude the other. So why can't the novel just continue doing its business as it has been doing? And then these new forms that you're talking about, they come and address the issues that we are now facing. I don't see that one rules out the other.
If I can say something there. The whole question of what is a small life today is itself so interestingly problematized by, all the other kinds of crises we're facing. I was very struck by this in Italy once, because, in Italy now, all the caregivers for the elderly, many of them are Bangladeshi, who actually traveled across, the Sahara, and they've been slaves in Libya, then they've risked their lives on the Mediterranean, to get to Italy. And once I remember I was walking beside this elderly Italian man who was being pushed along by his Bangladeshi caregiver. And this elderly man was bragging about all his sort of commodified adventures, going to the Amazon or going to Angkor Wat or whatever. And the Bengali guy was nodding along. And I just thought to myself, you should, if you want to know about adventure, ask your caregiver. He's the one who's really adventurous. I mean, the lives they've lived, these young migrants, they're literally unbelievable,
I think our futures are entwined, and that is going to have to reflect in any, whether we address the novel from the human or the more than human perspective. I think both parts of those are going to be urgently needed, and it's time to move to the audience. But before we go, I was so happy to see all of you start talking among yourselves, because I felt that you've been in conversation anyway, one way or the other, with your books, your writings, the way you think. Is there anything that you want to ask each other before we move to the audience?
When my first books were published, I remember the sort of critical stance in the Anglosphere amongst literary critics and so on. In the first place, they were sort of surprised that this Indian guy is writing at all. I mean, it's like the singing dog, as it were. What's he singing for? But back in those days, the whole sort of critical discourse was centered upon this idea that, these unfortunate third world people always write about politics, because politics is sort of endangering their lives. They're writing these narratives of the nation and so on. And which always struck me as so bizarre, because the real narratives of the nation are written in America. You just look at the number of novels which are preceded by American, an American mystery, an American life, etc. But that thing has completely turned around now. In the last 4 years, every single American writer is writing about Trump or the Trump years or something like that. So they've caught up with us.
So here we are, we're closing the session with a lovely provocation. And questions are open to the audience. I can barely see, oh good, the lights are back on. We're going to be kind to people at the back of the hall. So I see one lone hand right there at the back. Could we start with that? And then I promise we'll come to the front and the sides.
Hello, my name is Syed Raid. I am 15 years old. Before I proceed to my I must announce that I am humbled by such a noble presence on stage. My question is directed towards everyone on stage, is that as a 15-year-old, like, what advice would you give your 15-year-old self? Like, if you could talk to your 15-year-old self, what advice would you give to him?
What advice would you give to a 15-year-old about writing and reading? Or
About everything in general.
about
You know, I try to give advice to my 14-year-old, and she rejects every bit of it.
Well, I must say that I will consider your advice. Even if I don't, I must hear it. I'm interested.
Thank you so much. And just a quick request, could you keep questions crisp so that we can take as many voices as possible? That's the only reason. Yeah. Please come to the side, lady in front, and then the lady out there, and then we'll come to the center.
What a pleasure listening to all of you. I'm Farah, and I was wondering, you talked about the ordinary life and you talked about the disruptions of today. Common line or one common aspect and story, which is tolerance towards gender-based violence, tolerance towards class-based violence. And you know, we often hear about the 1% that gets all the advantages, 1% that makes all the money, and 1% that makes all the decision. I was wondering how you would take the planetary crisis and the gender disparity discrimination and come up with stories, novels, writings today. Because when climate change happens, there's child marriage. When there's salinity rising, there is urinary tract infection, reproductive health loss, all those problems, again, for women. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Everything is connected, so I think some of your fiction has addressed some of these issues. But would anyone like to comment on this? No, thanks. We move to the next question. The two ladies at the back, and then I promise we'll come to the center where...
Oh my God. So I just want to thank Mr. Amitav Ghosh, first of all, for writing about climate change, ecology and coexistence. Because I believe literature can literally save the world, because when we read about climate change or ecology or coexistence in any article, we really don't give that much damn about it. But when we read about it in fiction, we really care. And being a literature major, I mean, I really want to say that that has changed my life. So I want to ask Mr. Amitav Ghosh that he, being a writer about climate change, whose books or what kind of stories in real life or about in books has inspired him to write about these things in general, like coexistence, that we human beings are not the only living beings on earth. We really need to coexist, and coexistence matters. We need to take care of the earth and all the other living beings.
Thank you so much. What inspired you to write so much about coexistence? I think that's what I'm getting from.
Well, it was really the time I've spent in the Sundarban. You know, I would say really, you know, Leslie Marmon Silko and many Native American writers talk about how the land tells its own stories. And that's certainly been my experience. You know, the Sundarban, I find, has so captivated my mind that it continues to constantly emerge in my writing, whether I want it or not.
We have two questions from the center. If you can see the gentlemen who've had their hands up for a long time. Sorry, in the second, the middle row, and then there.
Thank you, everyone. My question is for Amitav sir. Yesterday you said that it surprises you that how much we moved by our life controlled by river. So your route is from Bikrampur, mine too, and my grandparents' old village, it went underwater as like you. So, and in that village there was a palace from the Same dynasty. It also went underwater. So can we say that everything is glass palace? That nothing is the center of the world, but because this palace was once center of the country, but now it's all gone. So can we say that everything is glass palace, even we?
It's certainly true that we in Bengal live in a completely unique ecosystem where there's a degree of geological instability that you don't really find anywhere else. I mean, rivers change their courses all the time. People lose their homeland all the time. And I think this does work its way into our consciousness. I mean, I find that all my life, without meaning to, I've been writing about rivers and about water and about the sea. It's simply because I think it comes from being from certain parts of the world.
Thank you. We've also got several questions after you. After you, the mic's going to move to the right-hand side, which is historically underrepresented with questions. Okay, we'll come back to you. Please go to the right and then we'll come back to you. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much for that lovely session. This is a question to all three, and also it's reflective of the title of today's talk. It seems that the theme of all of your work is that very much of the Benedict Anderson-esque imagined communities and borders. Then the question about people moving and migrating, and also then therefore the ecological aspects for which we also migrate and we move around. So if we are humans, creatures of motion, when you write your stories, and especially these small lives and the small stories, do you then think about whom you're speaking for, and therefore the voice that you're giving? And do you have your own battles as to whom you're speaking for and for the audience that you're speaking to? Thank you.
Abdul Razak, would you like to respond to that?
Who am I speaking to or for? I know who I'm speaking for. I'm speaking for me. So that's straightforward. So I don't have very much confusion about what the point of writing for me is to express what I see. Then what happens as a result of that, this is not, I'm not saying that I live in a bubble all on my own, but what I express is what I know and what I see, and these are my views. What I suppose I would wish would be the case is that somebody reading this would say, exactly, that's exactly how I've seen these things. Or possibly say, I never thought of that, that's interesting. Or, least likely, well I hope not, say, well this is a load of rubbish. But the primary impulse is not to speak for anybody, but to speak as I see things, and to hope that this will also have an echo for others and have meaning for others, and perhaps just some recognition to say, yep, I can see this, because this is how I read. When I read, my reaction is something like that. I receive what I read in that way. I receive what I read as, this is illuminating. This is not absolutely brand new idea, but this is something I've thought about, but I have not thought about it in quite this way. So that's one thing. Who do I speak for? Who do I speak to? Everybody. Everybody. I've never had this worry or concern about who is my audience, as it were. I just think I'm writing so anybody can read this if they wish.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would also add, I write really only for myself. What do I mean by that? I think I suppose I'm so preoccupied by the idea of making clear what I want to say that I'm not really thinking of an audience, just in the way you're not thinking of who you're representing in your writing, because you're really focused on articulating certain aspects of your experience. Now, it's a great bonus when the writing goes out into the world, other people read it, and like it. But in the end, as Abdul Razak said, anyone can access it. But in the end, you first of all writing it to clarify your own experience to yourself, and then sharing it with others. Also, I think the other question I made, how you cannot think about what you're representing because your experience is shaped in mysterious ways. Like Amitav saying, he writes about, he ends up writing about waterways or water bodies, and it's because his experience has been shaped by it in ways that he cannot really fully articulate. He can do it while he's writing, but he doesn't know what is happening there. So it's a very mysterious process in that sense. And I think questions of representation, which make us very self-conscious, don't really arise in that process.
I think it's because as a writer, you're always transcending yourself and you're speaking from behind the eyes of your characters so often. But anyway, sorry, I'll stop interpolating. There are so many hands up and the lady in red out there, and then we'll go back to that side and back to the center. Oh, this gentleman has been waiting. I'm so sorry. এটার পরে এখানে যাব. Is the mic not working? Just a second. Would you like this mic?
Thank you so much. Okay, so the time I have been speaking for and speaking from, right now representation is more cooler than ever. And you all started to write about apparently a small world when representation not as cool or as trendy as now. So thank you for that, of course. And my question is, when representation is now more cooler than ever, how do we as young writers actually fight the evil of misrepresentation? I actually ask this because in this time, like living in this era, we are not dealing with the demon of underrepresentation anymore or dealing with the degree of underrepresentation as before. But we are in an era where we are often faced with misrepresentation. So as young writers or anyone, young storytellers, how do we fight with the demon of misrepresentation?
I get it. You're asking how younger writers should deal with the problem of misrepresentation or the fear of misrepresentation, the problem of misrepresentation. I think a lot of that was just covered by these answers, but would anyone like to add to this, to speak to that fear that you might misrepresent? I'm sorry.
Look, I do think that one of the great anxieties that young writers carry is this fear of appropriation. I see that people are really tormented about it, and I don't know how to address that except that to say, how can you write without appropriating? I mean, if I were never to appropriate anything, I would only write about a sort of middle-aged Bengali man. And how interesting is that? So I do think you have to sort of give yourself license to try and understand other points of view.
Thanks so much for that. The two gentlemen in the center who've been waiting for a long while very patiently. Thank you. The gentleman in red and then behind him.
Hello. Very mundane and crisp questions, I hope, for each one of you. To Mr. Ghosh, you have so much research in your paper. I actually learned a lot about my family history from reading the class. Won't go into the great details, but how important do you think it is to have that much research into your novels? And then I'll quickly go to Mr. Mishra. One of the most fabulous books I've ever read is Butter Chicken in Ludhiana. But if I remember right, this was published way after you submitted it, right? Do you go back and see I would have written it differently now than when I wrote before? And my final question is to Mr. Gurna. Did you ever rub shoulders with Freddie Mercury?
Well, the research, I enjoy that. I think one of the great rewards of the life of writing is that you go out in the world, you meet people, you talk to people, you learn what people are thinking and so on. So that's a part of the job that I really love, actually. And I constantly draw inspiration from people I've met and seen. The question about rewriting a book. Yes, when you write a book, you enter into a kind of bubble. You create a bubble, and everything you're writing makes sense within that bubble. But once you step outside that bubble, you can never really go back into it. So now if I were to, try to read something I'd written before, I'd probably end up rewriting every sentence. But I wouldn't, because I know that that book belongs in that particular bubble.
I'm very insulted you didn't ask me the Freddie Mercury question. I think, I agree with Amitav. Rewriting, especially travel books, I'm thinking of Naipaul going back to do those journeys in Muslim countries. The result is not quite first rate, because the initial impulse has been lost. The initial hunger and curiosity has faded. And now you're really traveling to confirm your prejudices, which have, congealed and really cannot be got rid of anymore. So I think it's best to work with those fresh impulses and not try and sort of, go back to ground you've already covered.
Freddie Mercury, eh? I'd never heard of Freddie Mercury. Until people started saying, oh, he was born in Zanzibar. Did you know him? But I think his parents left when he was like 3 or something like that. So no, I didn't know him. And I don't know very much about him at all. And in fact, quite a lot of people in Zanzibar know nothing about him either. There is a restaurant which is actually, as it happens, is owned by a relative of mine, and it's called the Mercury. And tourists, when they go to Zanzibar, have to go there. So it's onto a really good thing. But it's really only tourists who go there, because it doesn't really mean anything very much to people in Zanzibar. I guess there may be people who are interested in music who might now say, really? Was he really? But I don't think he figures very much in sort of, rubbing shoulders with people. No, he doesn't figure in that.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry to those who haven't been able to ask their questions, but we really are out of time. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to the three of you, for this conversation and for everything your books have meant to us.